An arrogant businessman, a mysterious farmer, and a town full of secrets. Greg Mitchell thought he had everything under control, until he discovered that true power isn't measured in money. What he learned in that place would change his life forever. The roar of the black Range Rover's engine broke the silence of that morning in the small town of Oak Valley. Greg Mitchell, a hotel industry entrepreneur, adjusted his Italian tie and observed through the dark windows the simple houses that stretched along the main street. His astute eyes evaluated every detail of the place like a predator studying its prey. "This place is going to turn into gold," he muttered to himself as his GPS indicated he was approaching his destination, the town square. The 45-year-old businessman had built his empire from scratch, transforming small inns into luxury resorts across the country. His ventures were known for revolutionizing local economies, at least that's how he sold the idea. The truth was that his revolutions usually benefited himself more than the communities where he set up shop. Oak Valley was his newest obsession. The small town, nestled between lush mountains and cut by a crystal-clear river, was the perfect location for his most ambitious project, the largest luxury eco-resort in North America. The irony of the term eco didn't bother him. To him, it was just another marketing word. As he parked in the town square, Greg observed the town's movement beginning to stir. Shopkeepers opened their stores, ladies carried grocery bags, and uniformed children headed to school. To him, it was like observing a scene from an old movie, something that urgently needed modernization. That's when he spotted a man sitting on one of the benches in the square. Unlike the other residents who hurried past, he seemed perfectly at ease, as if he were part of the landscape itself. He wore a simple plaid shirt, faded jeans, and a straw hat that had seen better days. His calloused hands held a cup of coffee, and his eyes observed the movement with the tranquility of someone who knows every face that passes by. Greg decided this would be a good start for his investigations. After all, in small towns, the Hicks always knew everything. He adjusted his Armani suit and walked towards the man, his Italian shoes making a distinctive sound against the old pavement of the square. "Good morning," said Greg, with that rehearsed smile he used in business meetings. "I wonder if you could help me. I'm looking for information about landowners in the region." The man slowly raised his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good morning, sir," he replied with a heavy local accent. "Land around here? There's a lot of history to tell about that." Something in the man's tone made Greg feel slightly uncomfortable, but he quickly dismissed the sensation. "Actually, I'm specifically interested in the properties around the river. I heard they're the best lands in the region." "They are," agreed the man, taking another sip of his coffee. "The waters of Oak River are a blessing. Keep everything green all year round. You're not from around here, are you?" "No, I'm not," replied Greg, starting to get impatient. "I'm a businessman here on business. I intend to make some investments in the region." The man nodded slowly. "Investments? Interesting. And what kind of investments would those be, if it's not too nosy to ask?" Greg hesitated for a moment. Normally, he didn't discuss his plans with strangers, much less with some random hick. But something about this man intrigued him, and he found himself wanting to impress him. "I plan to build the largest eco-resort in North America," he announced, proudly. "It will bring progress to this town, jobs, tourism, development. You won't even recognize this place in 2 years." The man continued smiling, but his eyes gained a different gleam. "And the families who have lived here for generations? What happens to them in this plan of progress of yours?" The question caught Greg by surprise. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, much less by someone he considered so far below his social position. "Well, obviously they'll be properly compensated," he replied with disdain. "That's how progress works. Some need to adapt so that all can prosper." "Progress," muttered the man, now looking at the square with a thoughtful expression. "You know, mister, that word has different meanings for everyone. For you it might be money, luxurious buildings, rich tourists. For us here, progress is seeing our children growing up happy on the land our grandparents cultivated." Greg felt his face heat up. Who did this hick think he was to give him moral lessons? "Look, I just wanted to know who the landowners are. If you can't help me, I'll look for information elsewhere." The man got up calmly, revealing himself to be taller than he seemed when sitting. "The registry office is down that street," he pointed. "Miss Martha, the clerk, should be arriving now. She can show you all the records you want to see." Without waiting for a response, the man began to walk away. Before turning the corner, he turned and said, "Oh, and my name is Frank, but everyone around here knows me as Frank. I'm sure you'll hear a lot about me in the coming days." Greg stood there watching the man's figure disappear among the narrow streets of the town. There was something about that encounter that disturbed him, but he couldn't identify exactly what. Shaking his head to clear those thoughts, he began walking towards the registry office. He had a lot of work ahead and couldn't waste time with the ramblings of some random hick. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The Oak Valley Registry Office was an old mansion, with walls yellowed by time and tall windows that let in the morning light. When Greg pushed open the heavy wooden door, the sound of an old bell announced his arrival. The smell of old paper and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Miss Martha, a grey-haired lady with gold-rimmed glasses, looked up from her desk. Her astute gaze demonstrated the experience of someone who knew every document, every story, and every secret kept within those walls. "Good morning," said Greg, adjusting his posture. "I've come to consult the property records of the region, mainly the areas near Oak River." The clerk observed him for a few moments before responding. "You must be the businessman from New York," she commented, surprising Greg. "News travels fast around here." "Yes, that's me," he replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I intend to make some investments in the region. Important investments." Miss Martha got up slowly. "Well, the records are all organized, but first, would you like some coffee? I just brewed it." Greg wanted to refuse, but something in the lady's tone suggested that this was more than a simple invitation. It was almost a local ritual that he would need to respect if he wanted to obtain the information he was seeking. "I'll take some, thank you," he replied, sitting in the chair she indicated. As she poured coffee into antique porcelain cups, Miss Martha began to speak. "You know, these lands have history. They're not just pieces of paper with market values. Each acre has a special meaning for the families here." Greg held the cup, feeling the strong aroma of real coffee, so different from what he drank in his Italian coffee maker in New York. "I understand your point of view, but things change. Progress is inevitable." "Progress," murmured Miss Martha, and Greg had a déjà vu of the conversation with the man in the square. Funny how that word always appears when someone wants to change other people's lives. Before Greg could respond, she continued, "But you came for—" "The documents, not for my opinion. I'll fetch them." The clerk disappeared through a side door, leaving Greg alone with his thoughts. The walls of the registry office were covered with old photographs of the town. In one of them, which seemed to have been taken decades ago, a group of men posed in front of a farm. In the center of the photo, a young man smiled with the same straw hat that Greg had seen earlier in the square. His thoughts were interrupted when Miss Martha returned carrying a stack of yellowed folders. "Here's everything we have on the properties in the river region," she said, placing the documents on the table. Greg began to leaf through the records, his heart racing as he noticed a pattern in the documents. The same name appeared repeatedly. "Frank Johnson." "This isn't possible," he muttered, flipping through the pages more rapidly. "All these properties belong to the same person?" Miss Martha nodded. "Yes, to Frank. He inherited most of the land from his father, who in turn inherited it from his grandfather. His family was one of the founders of Oak Valley. But he looks like a—" Greg couldn't complete the sentence. "A hick?" completed Miss Martha with an ironic smile. "You're not the first to be fooled by Frank's appearances. He could live in a mansion, drive an imported car, wear designer clothes, but he prefers to continue being who he's always been." Greg felt cold sweat running down his back. His perfect plan was beginning to crumble. Not only had he discovered that the lands he intended to buy belonged to a single person, but that person was precisely the man he had treated with disdain minutes before. "And there's more," continued Miss Martha, seeming to enjoy the businessman's discomfort. "Frank isn't just the largest landowner in the region. He transformed his farms into a model of sustainable agriculture. He exports organic products worldwide, but he insists on keeping everything discreet without fanfare. The clerk's words echoed in Greg's mind. How had he, an experienced businessman, not researched better before coming? How had he not discovered that the lands he planned to buy belonged to one of the country's largest organic producers? But he was sitting on a park bench, drinking coffee from an old cup, protested Greg, more to himself than to Miss Martha. That's how Frank is, she replied, collecting the empty cups. Every day at 7 in the morning, he sits on that bench. He talks to everyone, listens to the town's problems, helps those in need. For him, wealth has nothing to do with showing off. Greg stood up, feeling dizzy. He needed to get out of there, reorganize his thoughts, create a new strategy. But before he could reach the door, Miss Martha called out to him. "Mr. Mitchell, one more thing," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Frank has an interesting saying. He always says that the land doesn't belong to those who buy it, but to those who love it. And here in Oak Valley, no one loves this land more than he does." The businessman left the registry office feeling the weight of those words. The sun was now high in the sky, and the town square was bustling with activity. Merchants, farmers, children, all seemed to know each other, greeting one another, sharing smiles and stories. It was then that Greg began to see Oak Valley through different eyes. It wasn't just a place stuck in time, waiting for his saving arrival. It was a living community, with its own rules, its own values, its own form of progress. And at the center of it all was Frank, the man he had belittled. The man who, with his simplicity and wisdom, had just given him the greatest lesson of his business life. Sometimes true power isn't in how much money you have, but in how you choose to live. Greg spent the rest of the morning wandering the streets of Oak Valley, his mind a whirlwind of contradictory thoughts. His wounded pride fought against a growing admiration for the man he had met in the square. His steps led him to a small diner on the corner of the town square, where he decided to stop for lunch and reorganize his ideas. The establishment was simple but welcoming, with checkered tablecloths and lace curtains on the windows. A plump lady with an easy smile greeted him as if he were an old acquaintance. "You must be the businessman from New York," she said, pulling out a chair. "I'm Mrs. Connie. Today we have beans and rice, fried chicken and ribs that melt in your mouth. What will you have?" "How do you know who I am?" asked Greg, still surprised at how quickly news traveled in this town. Mrs. Connie laughed. "Everyone knows everyone here, sir. And folks in suits and ties aren't something you see every day in these parts." As he savored a surprisingly delicious lunch, Greg observed the movement in the establishment. Farm workers, shopkeepers, and local school teachers mixed at the tables, chatting animatedly. The atmosphere was one of familiarity he hadn't seen since his childhood, when he visited his grandparents in the countryside. It was then that the door opened and Frank entered the diner. The buzz of conversations diminished for a moment, and several smiles and nods were directed at the farmer. He greeted everyone with the same simplicity he had shown earlier, stopping to exchange a few words with each person. To Greg's surprise, Frank walked directly to his table. "May I sit?" he asked, already pulling out a chair. The businessman nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "Mr. Frank Johnson, Frank," corrected the farmer with a smile. "Everyone here calls me Frank, and from what I see, you've already found out who I am." Greg felt his face flush. "Yes, I found out, and I apologize for how I treated you earlier. I didn't know. Didn't know I was rich," completed Frank, his eyes shining with amusement. "And would that change anything? Should the respect we have for others depend on the size of their bank account?" The question hit Greg like a punch to the stomach. His entire professional life had been built exactly on that principle, treating people according to their economic power. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own values. "I'll tell you a story," said Frank, signaling for Mrs. Connie to bring 2 coffees. "When my grandfather came to these lands almost 100 years ago, this was all wilderness. He started from scratch, planting, raising cattle, building a life. My father continued his work, but with a different vision. He believed that the land needed to be preserved, respected. He was the one who started with organic farming long before it became fashionable." Greg listened attentively, realizing that there was much more to this man than his simple appearance suggested. "When I took over the lands," continued Frank, "I decided that it wasn't enough just to produce. We needed to take care of the people too. Every family that works on my lands has a share in the profits. Their children study in quality schools, have health insurance, decent housing. It's not charity, it's justice." "But you could have so much more," argued Greg. "With all these assets, you could transform this place into a tourist hub, make millions, and destroy everything we've taken 3 generations to build," Frank countered, his tone still gentle but firm. "You see these people here?" He gestured to the diner's customers. "Each one of them has a story with this land. Each one of them is part of what Oak Valley is today. They're not pieces that can be moved from one place to another, like in a chess game." The coffee arrived, and for a few moments the two men sipped in silence. Through the window, Greg could see the town square, now busy with the afternoon hustle and bustle. Children played under century-old trees, ladies chatted on benches, shopkeepers attended to their customers with genuine smiles. "You know, Mr. Mitchell," Frank finally said, "you remind me a lot of my eldest son, Richard. He also believed that success meant having more and more, growing at any cost. He graduated in business administration from a famous university, went to work for a multinational in New York. He thought I was a fool for not modernizing our business." "And what happened to him?" asked Greg, genuinely interested. 2 years ago, he had a nervous breakdown. The pressure of work, the incessant pursuit of results, all of it consumed him from within. You know where he is now? Living in a simple house here in town, tending a community garden and teaching math at the local school. And for the first time in his life, he says he feels truly happy. Frank's words reverberated in Greg's mind. How many nights had he spent in luxurious hotel rooms, feeling completely empty? How many relationships had he sacrificed in the name of success? How many times had he confused the value of things with their price? "I'm not saying you're wrong in wanting to invest, in seeking progress," Frank continued, "but maybe you need to rethink what progress really means. Is tearing down century-old houses to build a resort really an advancement? Is expelling families from their lands to create a playground for the rich really development?" The afternoon sun was beginning to lower, painting the sky in orange hues. Through the diner's window, Greg observed the town with different eyes. He no longer saw a backward place needing his saving intervention. He saw a living, pulsating community with its own values and its own form of prosperity. "Mr. Frank," he finally said, "I think I need to rethink a lot of things." The farmer smiled, that same serene smile that had left Greg so irritated in the morning. "You've already taken the first step," he said, standing up. "You're beginning to see beyond appearances." When Frank left the diner, Greg remained seated, observing the town's movement through the window. For the first time in many years, he felt that perhaps he had something to learn from a place that, hours earlier, he had considered backward and insignificant. That night, staying at the town's only inn, Greg couldn't sleep. Frank's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of his own journey. He got up and walked to the room's window, observing the quiet town under the moonlight. The inn, though simple, had a charm of its own that he hadn't noticed when he arrived. The antique wooden furniture told stories, the handmade patchwork. Quilts brought a coziness that no five-star hotel could replicate. On the nightstand, a jug of fresh water had been left with a handwritten note. "Good night, God bless you, Mrs. Betty." He took out his phone and began researching about Oakville and Frank's companies. To his surprise, he discovered several articles in specialized magazines about the sustainable business model developed in the region. Frank Thompson's organic farms were a world reference in regenerative agriculture and fair trade. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself. The next morning he woke up early, determined to get to know better the town he had planned to transform. At the inn's reception, he met Mrs. Betty, a lady of about 70, who greeted him with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well, my dear?" she asked, serving him a cup of coffee with still warm cornbread. "Yes, ma'am," Greg replied, surprised at himself for enjoying this simple moment. "Mrs. Betty, do you know Frank well?" The lady's eyes sparkled. "Do I know Frank? I watched that boy grow up. He was one of those who always stopped here after school to eat my cornbread. Even after he went to study in the city, he never changed his simple ways." "He studied in the city?" Greg asked, interested. "Graduated in agricultural engineering from UC Berkeley with a master's degree from Cornell," Mrs. Betty answered proudly. "But he came back here as soon as he finished his studies, said his place was here with his people." That information surprised Greg even more. Frank wasn't just a farmer who had inherited land. He was an educated man who had consciously chosen to maintain his roots and traditions. After breakfast, he decided to do something he had never done on his business trips. Walk around the town without an agenda, without objectives, just observing and talking to people. At the bakery, he met Mr. John, who told how Frank had helped modernize his production without losing the traditional recipes that had been successful for 3 generations. At the pharmacy, Mrs. Clara explained how the farmer had created a medicinal herb cultivation program that served the entire region. Arriving at the local school, Greg had an even bigger surprise. The building, while maintaining its historical architecture, was equipped with cutting-edge technology. In the garden, children tended to an educational vegetable patch, learning about sustainable agriculture and healthy eating. "All of this is Frank's initiative," explained Principal Mary. Helen, who saw him observing the facilities. "He believes that quality education is the foundation of any true progress." During lunch, sitting again at Mrs. Connie's diner, Greg reflected on everything he had discovered. Oakville wasn't a town stuck in time as he had initially thought. It was a place that had found its own path to development, respecting its traditions and identity. That's when Richard, Frank's son, entered the establishment. Greg recognized him from the description the farmer had given the day before. The young teacher greeted everyone naturally, and upon seeing Greg, approached his table. "You must be the businessman from New York," he said, extending his hand. "My father told me about you." "Your father is an impressive man," Greg replied, indicating the chair across from him. Richard smiled. "You know, I used to think like you. Thought success meant tall buildings, imported cars, fat bank accounts. It took me a while to understand what my father always knew, that true wealth isn't measured just in money." "What was your experience in New York like?" Greg asked, genuinely interested. "I was an executive at a multinational," Richard answered, his eyes losing themselves for a moment in memories. "I earned very well, traveled the world, had all the status symbols. You can imagine. And I was completely unhappy." "And what made you change?" "One day I was in an important meeting in Manhattan negotiating the purchase of a family business. The owner, an elderly gentleman, looked me in the eyes and said, 'Young man, you're trying to buy something that's not for sale. Our history, our dignity.' Those words hit me like lightning. I realized I had become exactly the kind of person my father always tried not to be." Greg felt a lump in his throat. Richard's words echoed his own experiences, his own doubts. "I came back to Oakville thinking it would be temporary," Richard continued. "But when I started working with the kids at the school, participating in community projects, seeing the real impact we can have on people's lives, well, I discovered that's worth more than any corporate bonus." The afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, illuminating the tables where families and friends shared not just meals, but also stories and affection. Greg observed everything with different eyes, beginning to understand that perhaps his concept of progress needed to be completely rethought. "You know," said Richard, getting up to return to the school, "my father always says that true innovation isn't in destroying what exists to build something new, but in finding ways to make the old and the new walk together." That afternoon, Greg walked to the central square and sat on the same bench where he had first met Frank. He observed the town's movement, people greeting each other, children playing, elderly folks chatting in the shade of the trees. For the first time in a long time, he felt a peace that none of his luxury developments had managed to provide. The next morning, Greg woke up to the sound of birdsong and the local church bell. He had made a decision during the night, after hours of reflecting on everything he had experienced in the last few days. He dressed more casually, leaving his tie and jacket in the room, and headed to the central square. As expected, He found Frank in his usual spot, drinking coffee and observing the town waking up. The farmer didn't seem surprised to see him approach. "Good morning, Mr. Gregg," Frank greeted, indicating the bench beside him. "Care for some coffee?" "Good morning, Mr. Frank," Gregg replied, sitting down. "Actually, I came to make a different proposal than I had initially planned." Frank smiled, his eyes shining with curiosity. "And what would this new proposal be?" "I want to learn from you," said Gregg, surprising himself with the humility in his voice. "I've spent the last few days getting to know Oakville, talking to people, observing how everything works here. You've built something extraordinary, something that money alone can't buy." The farmer remained silent, waiting for Gregg to continue. "Instead of trying to transform Oakville into just another generic tourist destination, I'd like to propose a partnership. I want to learn how you manage to develop a business model that respects local traditions and is still extremely successful." "And what happened to your plans for the resort?" Frank asked, although his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "I realized I was looking at everything through the wrong lens," Gregg admitted. "I thought progress meant demolishing the old to build the new. But you showed me that it's possible to grow while preserving what's most valuable: identity, relationships, sense of community." At that moment, the square was coming to life. Shopkeepers were opening their stores, children were passing on their way to school, ladies were carrying grocery bags. Every person who passed greeted Frank with genuine respect and affection. "You know, Mr. Gregg," Frank finally said, 20 years ago I received a proposal similar to the one you came to make initially. A big group wanted to transform Oakville into a tourist hub. They offered a lot of money, promised jobs, development. And why did you refuse? Because I understood that some things are priceless. The joy of seeing children playing freely in the streets, the pride of producing food that nourishes people instead of just generating profits, the satisfaction of preserving a way of life that respects the land and people. That can't be bought with any amount of money." Gregg nodded, deeply understanding what Frank meant. His own resorts spread across the country had generated impressive profits, but how many communities had been decharacterized in the process? "But your partnership proposal interests me," Frank continued, surprising Gregg. "Not to transform Oakville, but to use our experience as a model for other communities, to show that it's possible to grow without destroying, to innovate without losing essence." Gregg's eyes sparkled with the possibility. "Are you suggesting that together we could create a new type of consultancy?" Frank completed. "Not to implement standardized resorts, but to help other towns find their own path to sustainable development. Use your experience in management and mine in community development to create something truly innovative." The idea began to take shape in Gregg's mind. Instead of imposing a single model of development, they could work with each community to enhance their strengths, preserve their identity, and still generate prosperity. "Richard could help us," Frank suggested. "He has experience in both the corporate world and local development. And more importantly, he learned in practice that success and happiness don't always follow the same path." At that moment, Gregg realized he was experiencing a turning point in his life. His father's last words before passing away echoed in his mind. "Son, success isn't about how much you have, but about what you leave for others." "Mr. Frank," he said, extending his hand, "I think this is the beginning of a very special partnership." The farmer shook his hand firmly. "Welcome to Oakville, Mr. Gregg, not as an investor but as a partner in true progress." In the months that followed, Gregg sold most of his resorts and redirected his investments to the new project. The roots of Progress Consultancy, as it was called, became a reference in sustainable development, helping communities across the country to grow without losing their essence. And every morning, as the sun rose over Oakville, two men could be seen sitting on the bench in the central square, drinking coffee and talking about the true meaning of success and progress. One of them still wore his worn straw hat, while the other had definitively traded his expensive suits for a simplicity he now recognized as true wealth. Dear listeners, we hope that Gregg and Frank's story has touched your hearts and shown that true transformations begin when we open our eyes and hearts to new perspectives. To continue this journey of discovery, we've prepared a special playlist with equally inspiring stories about people who found their true purpose. Find it here, clicking on your left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and make us reflect on our values and choices. Also, share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment of the story touched your heart the most? Have you ever experienced a similar transformation? Don't miss our upcoming content. Together we can discover that the most valuable stories are those that make us grow inside. Until next time.